Let's circle around back to that argument for authorship. Something so beautiful, so nuanced, was clearly or must have been from a remarkable individual or set of individuals. Why not just call this individual Muhammad?
Right. Okay. So one question is thinking through the relationship between the career of Muhammad and the composition of the book. That's the biggest issue, actually. The real question is, does this book have literary traits of being a transcript? Either a transcript, this is the standard idea of things Muhammad said here and there that was just compiled, or I guess someone could say, oh, maybe it's not a transcript. The Meccan stuff was not said in Mecca, but it was Muhammad himself who sat down, over a couple of weeks maybe, and wrote down these 114 units, these 114 surahs. I guess that's possible. However, to me, it's much more attractive to think of the Quran in the context of the early Islamic community, where there are a couple of things that are key. Two, really. One, the formation of a text for the community's ritual use, which I already mentioned on. And then second, which I haven't spoken about much, is community formation, instilling certain norms in the community.
Solomon and Smith.
Welcome to Solomon and Smith. I am Jack Truckenpetter. That is Milo Garner. Neither one of us is Solomon or Smith, but together we are Suleiman and Smith. Who wrote the Quran? Who wrote the Quran? I yell in a bush. Who wrote the Quran? Now, 2 billion of you are going to answer God. That's probably the most popular answer. It's a bit unclear how much exactly God writes. Does he write every single consonant and vowel? Maybe a bit of wiggle room there. It's also slightly unclear whether God authored other books or co-authored other books. Was God a co-author of the Hebrew Bible? Was God a co-author of the New Testament? Were those books kind of like Guillermo del Toro's The Hobbit, and there's been studio interference that's perverted the original vision and the actual Hobbit movies we got, namely Judaism and Christianity? They weren't what was meant to be they weren't what it was meant to be. They interfered with the artistic vision. And the Quran is like the director's cut version of Christianity and of Judaism. If you are one of the 6 billion people who doesn't believe that God wrote the Quran, you're left with a few kind of interesting questions, like, where does this book come from? This is a weird book to exist. You got Arabic, this language with like no literary tradition whatsoever, and suddenly this huge, sophisticated behemoth comes out of the desert sands. There's something kind of a bit spooky, even to the most atheistic people, about the emergence of the Quran. The very existence of the Quran is used by Islamic apologists as an argument for the verity of their religion. So you've got a few options. The most traditional one among sort of Enlightenment secular scholars, mainly in Europe, in the West, is that Muhammad was the author. Muhammad was the sole author. Either he was dictating it to someone, or he was a writer himself, and the Islamic sources are lying about his illiteracy. But basically you get this whole tradition, starting in the 19th century, of scholars who just believe Muhammad must be the source of this thing, that all of it must come at least through Muhammad in some sense. Okay, with maybe later additions, but the vast majority of the text comes from Muhammad. And if you read like 19th century German Quranic scholarship, they're like, these people are like psychologizing the Quran. They're like, oh, I wonder what Muhammad was thinking when he wrote this bit. I wonder whether Muhammad had a stomachache when he wrote this little bit. You know, things that are completely unthinkable when secular scholars talk about, Moses writing Genesis. In some cases, the very same people who cast so much skepticism on the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch are the same people who are like, yeah, Muhammad definitely wrote the Quran. Probably all of it. Some of this might have been to do with just 19th century great man fetishization. Europeans in the 19th century, especially Germans, just really loved the idea of these magisterial great men who can just seize history and change history just by saying things, and they liked to imprint this onto Muhammad. Our guest today, Gabriel Said Reynolds, is in the minority in casting a lot of suspicion and doubt on whether Muhammad wrote any of the Quran. He's open to the idea that there may have been a single author, but thinks when you look at the standard accounts of Muhammad's life and what we know about Muhammad and what we have in the Quran, there are just a variety of things that should cause skepticism. We discuss some of the textual features of the Quran that seem to suggest a different author or different authors, certain aspects of the Quran that seem to suggest something much more communal in intent, something more like a prayer book, something to facilitate worship. We put to Gabriel lots of the sort of standard arguments for Muhammad's authorship, or at any rate Muhammad's critical involvement in the transmission of the Quran. We put to him the standard arguments about the inimitability of the book, the sort of magic of the book's creation, the uncanniness of the book's creation, and he casts a sort of moderating, skeptical response to all of these sort of standard lines of argument. We discuss some of the structural features of the Quran. Why is it ordered longest book to shortest book rather than chronologically or thematically? We briefly discuss the emergence of the Arabic language. We discuss whether the Quran is actually that much of a literary achievement. Is the Quran really as beautiful as believers tend to say it is, or is it a mixed bag? Are there a few beautiful sections that... Ooh, a butterfly. Are there like a handful of beautiful sections that are mostly just in a sea of slop in a sort of 1-to-10 ratio? Now, look at this flower. A bit of a side note, but I'm a big fan of this thing. It's, look at this. Wait for the focus. Turn up the light a bit. But yeah, this is called Viper's Bugloss, or Bugloss, I think. I just really love this. Like, look at this. I love the sort of the pink little stems coming out of this specific shade of blue. It's a gorgeous colouring.
Please like this video, leave a comment down below, preferably a completely unhinged and berserk comment. Subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed already. Join the herd. We herd our subscribers to paradise. We are shepherds of the soul, shepherds of the intellect. You can also support us over on Patreon, where you gain access to extra material on the Quran, on the Aeneid, on the Bible, on a variety of groovy books. You also help us to continue having these conversations on the main channel. We are enormously grateful for all the support we get. Thank you so much. Without any further ado, here is Gabriel Said Reynolds.
You pronounce it Milo? Is that the right
Milo.
Milo. Okay, thanks. Good. Glad
Not
I
long
asked.
eye, yeah.
Who does say Milo? It's like Italians, right? Venus de
I
Milo.
know a
think
guy.
that-
I may be just spacing out, but I knew a guy who worked on Arabic, like creating different fonts for Arabic script. I think he was Dutch. I don't know. And I thought he went by Milo, but who knows?
Well, thank you ever so much for making time once again, Gabriel. Pleasure to have you. I'm a big fan of your channel and everything you're doing to sort of create popular access to Islamic Studies material online. So it's really great. We start our conversations with a poetic epigraph. This one I wrote last night. I have written the only book in the world. It is the world, and is in the world, and is older than the world, collapsing into the clouds, into a bed of cotton thistle, corn, cockle, and campion, dripping warm, white water into the heart. Its covers are soft eyelids closing on human life, in a blink that obscures all our doings and days, the deaths of our fathers and the births of our sons, and all our petty loves and griefs. Its pages are our burning bodies merging with the sand and oozing clear glass. Its ink is the blood of darkness, spilled from its war with the light. I have written the book that gave birth to its author, whose words are hot as stars and impenetrable as the frozen astral wastes between them. I have written the book that suckled the infant God and gave him nourishment to build being from bricks of nothingness, and speak a cosmos into the womb of each bride as she suffers her agonies on a table. I'll hand over to Milo for our to kick off our chat.
So I think today our conversation will mostly revolve around the authorship of the Quran. Who wrote it, over what period, on what basis? And I think maybe we should start with that very simple question. Who is thought to have written the Quran? We have a traditional narrative that
Mhm.
Muhammad orated it, essentially, and either wrote it down or it was written down by scribes. And then we have some competing academic arguments. Could you give us a little an idea of the layout?
Yeah, terrific. So, yeah, thank you, Milo. Thanks, Jack. Very happy to be with you. That's, of course, the big question in the background, I think, of every work of Quranic studies scholarship. But it's a question that's generally ignored in the field of academic Quranic studies, with some exceptions. And that's sort of remarkable, right? I think maybe without parallel in sort of analogous fields of scholarship. So folks will often say, and I do this too, the Quran says this, the Quran says that. I've tended to write more recently about the Quranic author. So in the background of that sort of evasion is the question of who is the author of the Quran. And as you noted, Milo, the standard Islamic teaching is that God is the author of the Quran. Muhammad simply relayed the messages given to him by God. There are lots of nuances, different Muslim takes or explanations, some of which would give a little more active role to the articulation of the Arabic words of the Quran to Muhammad. But I mean, 99% of believing Muslims who wrote the Quran, God. And when they quote the Quran, that shows through because even, in a kind of sort of academic context within Muslim circles, a quotation of the Quran will simply be introduced as God said, قال Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something like this.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, from an academic perspective, the assumption for decades and decades and decades of Western scholarship, really from the beginning, and we can get into this in more detail if it's interesting, is that Muhammad wrote the Quran. In my opinion, as a sort of non-Muslim, non-confessional, historical, critical scholar, Muhammad is not the author of the Quran, but instead we can describe the certain features of the Quranic author, his historical context, but not identify him by name. So I think we can get pretty far in thinking about who the human historical author of the Quran was, but not know his identity exactly.
I
And
notice
we suppose,
you're using the singular author. Just
yeah,
to
I was
jump
about to
in.
mention.
Yeah. Do you think that single authorship is the most likely version of Quranic authorship? Do you think that this side for it all coming from a single source? It might not be Muhammad, it might not be God, but it all seems to come from a single source. Do you think this is the most convincing argument?
I think if I were simply to say yes, the some of the complications would be lost. So I think there's a defensible case to be made that there's one principal author, and folks have tried to argue this with different kinds of text analysis, digital humanities tools. I think there's a defensible case to be made, but I think if someone simply says yes, it will leave the impression in the audience that, there's one guy, one scribe, sitting down somewhere in his house in Medina or somewhere, and he wrote the whole thing out. And I think the story is more complicated than that.
And in what way is it complicated? Do we imagine? I mean, we have this time span inherent to the Quranic
Yes.
narrative. We have this notion that it was revealed over about 2 decades, and then we have the dating of the various surahs. We have the early, middle, late Meccan surahs, and then come the longer, typically Medinan
Right.
surahs
Exactly.
coming over a certain period of time, and so there is built into the book a sense of its longevity. However, there are arguments that it was composed over a much longer period, and indeed, in that case, perhaps compiled or composited by people other than an original author. Where does the scholarship stand, as it were, on that notion of time, of expanse?
Right. So I think if if I answer where does scholarship stand and what is my opinion, there'll be
Hmm.
two very different answers. I think I'm in the
Okay.
minority among academic scholars. Sorry, we're going to add something there, Jack. Or,
No, no, I was curious, yeah, just to if you could outline both, that would be very helpful.
yeah, terrific. Yeah. So the majority view of academic scholarship on the formation of the Quran is that more or less it is a compilation of the things Muhammad said between Mecca and Medina. And this really, I mean, this is like the shibboleth, or it's the key question that, or the starting point for two different paths one can follow in analyzing the Quran. So if you make a decision for this way of seeing the Quran's formation, it has serious implications for the way you analyze the message of the Quran itself. So the standard view, the majority view, is that the Quran is more or less a record of the things Muhammad said in Mecca and Medina. And just to remind folks, I don't know if everyone will know kind of the timeline of the tradition, which, is not, even for scholars in this camp, it's not really precise because the Islamic calendar anyway deals with Islamic dates based on a lunar year. So it's really a simplification when we have sort of, the Gregorian calendar dates based on a solar year. Nevertheless, the standard dates everyone uses is that Muhammad began his career as a prophet in AD 610, AD or CE 610, and carried on until his death in AD 632. And that, as you said, Milo, that's divided between a Meccan period and a Medinan period. You were even more precise because you indicated kind of the classic Western scholarly division into three different Meccan periods. So that's not part of Islamic tradition, by the way. That comes from the history of Western scholarship. I think it was Gustav Weil in around 1850. I mean, pretty early on, who came up with that division, which is adopted by the great, founding figure of Quranic studies, Theodor Nödeke, who publishes his book around 1860. So, therefore, you could analyze any passage of the Quran, and uh, with this format, you could then kind of locate it, pin it to one of these four periods. And then, so you look at a passage. So, Quran 7, for example, by tradition is Meccan. And you say, okay, so Muhammad was in Mecca when he said these words. And maybe they were refined a little bit. A Western scholar would say, maybe, by the folks who, after Muhammad's death, actually wrote down the Quran. So there might have been some, modest sort of editing. But essentially, this is what Muhammad really said in Mecca, or Quran 2, what Muhammad really said in Medina. I think, scholars who kind of think, even in this camp, scholars who think through this kind of more carefully would say, okay, actually, the stylistic nature of the Quranic language suggests that possibly there was more sort of a work that went into the final form of the Quran. And there's a lot more to be said there, but that would be kind of the standard view. So we have what is maybe not a transcript of what Muhammad said, say on a Tuesday morning in Mecca outside his house in whatever 617 or something. Maybe it's not an exact transcript of his very words. I mean, did he actually use even this kind of register of Arabic? But it's more or less, a version of what he said.
And
So that's the first part.
that's the
Yeah.
first part. Now your part, yeah. Your position?
Yeah, so I mean, just to indicate some of the problems that I find in the standard view, one way to kind of identify them is to think about the passages which have quotations of Muhammad's opponents. So we have a lot of verses in the Quran. These are sometimes referred to as counter discourse, in which the Quran has God say, or the Quranic author has God say, we know that they say X. So it could be like only a human is teaching him, right? So this is a statement of an opponent of Muhammad, which the Quranic author has God quote, right? We know that they say X, only a human is teaching him. Quran 16, we have this verse, I think it's 103. And then in this verse, is not the format, something else is said, but very often it says, say to them, why? So, and the say to them is second person singular. So Muslim would say, this is God who has heard the opponents of Muhammad in Mecca saying certain words, and then God is telling just Muhammad, this is how you should respond to them. Okay, so if one kind of analyzes this from kind of a text critical perspective, we notice certain things. For example, these counter discourse passages, they are in the same register, the same style as other elements of the Quran. So, is this a direct quotation of what some enemies say, Abu Sufyan or Abu Lahab, one of the enemies? Is it a direct quotation? Did he also speak in that language? Well, most people would kind of grant, even believing Muslims would kind of grant, no, it's not a direct quotation. It's God's formulation in God's own style.
Straw manning.
Maybe, I mean, a believing Muslim probably wouldn't say that, but yeah, I mean, that's the general idea, like he's giving the gist of what Abu Lahab was maybe just thinking. Maybe Abu Lahab didn't even say it. Uh, but also these quotations of opponents, they rhyme with
Okay.
the verses before and after them, in almost every case. Uh, so there's a lot to be said. Also, the element of these sorts of passages in the Quran, which have God only speak to Muhammad. Now, this is curious because why is this being broadcast to everyone? This is a private message between God and Muhammad. And to me, the best explanation or the best answer to those sorts of questions is that no, this is a thoughtful literary production of a text. It's giving the audience a sort of fly on the wall effect. You get to listen in. One could easily think of, in the formation of a young religious community, the attraction of this sort of rhetorical device. And so we really should kind of step outside the whole idea, which is so foundational to Western Quranic studies, of what was going on with Muhammad and the community when he said these words. Instead, think of the rhetorical style of the Quran, the formation of a young religious community, and why this would be the sort of literary product of that community.
Yeah, it's interesting because I recently read the Arthur Arbery translation, seeking out sort of the most poetic version in English, perhaps not the most accurate, but he
But
was
that, yeah,
fairly
that is
insistent.
that is the one people point to, Milo. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was very insistent in using the archaic thou versus you forms for the second person, and that sort of explains, I suppose, why to not make that mistake. Because if
Definitely.
you
Definitely.
use the you, it sounds like a general, and you, the people, should
Yes.
say this, but
Yes.
using the specific thou, it makes it more directional.
And Milo, there's another translation done by Alan Jones of Oxford, who wanted it to be sort of contemporary English, so he doesn't use the thou, and but he puts a superscript S or P with the word you
Okay.
to
Mm.
indicate whether it's singular or plural, which doesn't have this sort of artistic vibe maybe of Arbery, but at least it gets the message across.
In these
Yeah, and I
standard,
think
go,
something.
go on, Milo.
Oh,
Sorry.
go ahead, Jack. Oh, okay. Well, I just something that I'm interested in specifically to do with the Quran because I think it might be the only book that's arranged in this way, which is to say the surahs are in organized by length, not chronology, not really by theme, not by anything else, but the longest to the shortest. And it achieves what traditionally is considered a sort of anti-chronology, in that a lot of the longer chapters are considered to be
Exactly.
Medinan,
Exactly.
and a lot of the shorter ones, especially the shortest surahs, some of which are single page on a standard codex, are considered the
Exactly.
earliest
Yes.
Meccan. But Why was it that the book came to be arranged this way when there are at least composited notions of the chronology? Why
Yes.
did when the codex or when the canon was established, why did they go for this quite unusual and striking arrangement, which reading from back to front can be confusing, can be repetitive, can be sort of over here, over here, over here. What do we know about that?
A terrific question, and I think it's actually the sort of question that can open up doors towards a greater, a deeper understanding of kind of the historical context in which the Quran was composed. And that is because to me, this order reflects the interest of the authors of the text, um, or author, in establishing essentially a book that is easily adapted for the worship of the community, so for ritual use. And I think this is a really key element of understanding the Quran's formation. There are a number of signs which suggest that the author was interested in providing the community a book with which it could worship. So this,
Hmm.
I mean, this is actually a pretty big distinction, which is not always emphasized in Quranic studies scholarship. So just if we compare it to the Bible, it's complicated because the Bible is an extremely complicated book. But many books of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and the New Testament, are essentially narratives. Obviously, you have other things, because you have the Psalms, which I'll speak out about in a moment, and other sort of poetic passages, even in the prophetic books. But if you think of the Pentateuch, these are basically narratives with some legal material. The Gospels, basically narratives. And so that kind of narrative, whether it's the people of Israel developing this book or the early Christian community, is meant principally to communicate sort of data or content, right? So here's some information. It's really important. I want to give it to you. So does the Quran do that? Or is that the principal concern of the Quran? Clearly, there is data and content. There are theological and other messages, yes. But it is also a book clearly composed with verses in rhyme. And all of that suggests that it was meant, the author intentionally was developing a book to be used by the community in its ritual prayer. And I could really go on and on about this, so I'll just keep it short and you can follow up. But if one thinks of the historical, and I need to circle back on the length issue, but one thinks of the historical context, Christians around and Jews around in this period of time, early 7th century AD, CE, uh, they are worshiping God principally with the Psalms. So Psalms, is a collection usually of 150 units of text, which clearly are composed also in a verse-like structure, and which have artistic elements, and which also have like this, the element of kind of like a hymnal. It's meant to be used for the community to worship God. So we see in the Quran a number of elements, one of which is the organization of longest, more or less, longest to shortest, which seem to be adapted for the ritual use of the community. So in this case, by the way, there is an analogy to this in the decision of the early church to organize Paul's letters, which were also from an early period used in recitation in liturgy. All of Paul's letters, the 13 letters of Paul, from Romans to Philemon, they go from longest to shortest.
Ah.
This was a known kind of format for ritual use, and I think that's what's going on with the Quran.
Yes, maybe it's more analogous to something like the Book of Common Prayer, just something a book that we use, not a book that we well, it's different because it's taking the mantle of the Bible and the
Yes.
scriptural authority of the Bible, but in terms of actual practical day-to-day use, it's more analogous to a prayer book, to a collection of psalms and prayers for specific occasions. And there is obviously the legalistic stuff in there as well. I'd love us to go back briefly to sort of the orthodox Islamic position and some of the kind of apologetics around the Quran and proving that it's all coming from a single source. I'd like to clarify first of all what even is the standard account of how the text gets written. So you have Muhammad. He's Tuesday morning. He's in front of his house and he's speaking in Arabic rhyme to the people. And then is the standard account that a scribe is immediately writing it down, or is it that somebody is remembering it perfectly? Is Muhammad repeating these things on multiple occasions? Like, what are some of the standard accounts of how the book goes from oral to written?
Yeah, yeah, terrific. And it's a complicated matter because we have so many different narrations in the early Islamic accounts, both of, well, it's not just two, it's more than both. There's so many different narrations in the standard Islamic sources of how Muhammad received or experienced revelation. Also, how his proclamation of those revealed messages were recorded, and then finally, how they were brought together actually on parchment and put into a codex. So, on those three elements of what Muslims would see as the transmission of the Quran, there's lots of different narrations. These
Okay.
tend to be in sort of introductions to the Quran by believing Muslim authors or by, say, non-Muslims who want to summarize the Islamic account. These tend to be collapsed into a single narrative. And there's been really, one of sort of the uh, provocative and I think very intriguing scholars who's been working on this sort of thing is Stephen Shoemaker. So he wrote a book called Creating the Quran, where he really emphasizes this. He's like, listen, everyone, so like everyone knows the standard account, but actually read the Islamic sources. You have dozens of different versions of all three of those stages of the
Hmm.
transmission of the Quran. But
Hmm.
the collapsed account, if that's okay, just to sort of summarize that, like if you pick up a standard book, by a Muslim or a Western scholar summarizing the Islamic account, it would be that Muhammad received a message. Here, the Muslim and the non-Muslim might sort of explain it in different ways. Received a message, proclaimed it orally. He was illiterate, maybe. He was illiterate, and so he wasn't writing these things down. But between 610 and 632, he proclaimed it orally. Folks around him memorized this. And then some scholars might emphasize that at an early point, they were already reciting it, and
Hmm.
this kind of repetition of the recitation aided sort of the memory process. Muhammad possibly, although folks don't speak about this very much, could have recited the same revelation in a second or third or fourth occasion, if he felt that it was sort of in his prudential judgment, if he felt it was useful to do so again. And then also he was getting instruction from an angel, or he was thinking through how to put these different proclamations into a final order. So the order of
Hmm.
the Quran, as as Milo said, which does not follow the tradition about the chronological order in which Muhammad proclaimed them, the order of the Quran is also seen by Muslims to be divinely established. So Muhammad was also part of that, or the angel was instructing Muhammad also on that process. So those two things are going on at the same time, right? Because the first verses of the Quran are today, from a traditional standpoint, are today found in chapter 96 or Surah 96, Surah Al-Alaq. It's not Surah 1. So he had to decide, or someone had to tell him that this should be number 96 in the Quran. And then, the second stage, just I'll make this really quick so I don't go on. The second stage would then be after Muhammad's death, everyone met together, and things go on during the time of the first Caliph Abu Bakr. Everyone met together. Some people had memorized the Quran. There were folks who wrote it down, folks who were literate in different places, and they came up basically with one text. And then there's a third stage, which is more complicated during the reign of the third caliph, when there's kind of one official text that's disseminated throughout the caliphate.
Hmm.
And I'm interested, just on this point of we have this oration, and we have this religion that, according to some, especially some of the traditional accounts, almost comes from nowhere. And this is part of its divinity. We're in
Mhm.
this pagan Hijaz, and
Yes,
then
yes.
out of that springs this extremely developed monotheism, this extremely
Mhm.
developed
Mhm.
theology, of
Mhm.
which there is no real strong textual precedent. And it's even the Quran says it itself. It says, if this is false, why don't you write a Quran? Why don't you write something better
Yes,
than this?
yes.
And it's a fairly confident remark because, as far as we can tell, no one ever did or tried, or at least the attempt didn't survive. But I'm curious about the Quran as a holy book, almost uniquely aware of its status as not the first, nor even the second, but at the very least the third in a series. Especially these later Medinan surahs, they frequently talk about people of the
Mhm.
book. They talk about
Mhm.
the gospel. They talk about the Torah. Now, they also talk about these books in a way that we do not apparently have them preserved, that we have corrupted or altered
Mhm.
versions. And there is this tradition of the unaltered true accounts that were given to people in the past, and that there is
Yes,
some kind
yes.
of textual transmission. But what do we know about these? We could call them the Islamic gospel, the Islamic Torah. Is there any evidence of a sort of almost like a Gnostic sub-belief that may have been the context out of which
Mhm.
Islam pranced? When they refer to these books,
Mhm. Mhm.
surely we can't imagine they're completely imaginary. Well, I suppose there must have been an unaltered gospel, even though we don't have it. Is there any argument that we can say there were versions of Christian texts, versions of Jewish texts that did marry themselves more naturally to the account we get in the Quran as we have it today?
Yeah, there's no evidence at all for that. So it's a really sort of either just an affirmation that comes from faith in the traditional Islamic interpretation of those passages, just trust, even though there's no real historical evidence. Um, yeah, or uh, one can, try to come up with this or that. So famously, I mean, not very famous. In Quranic studies, it's well known that folks will be like, oh, but there was a diatessaron. So, in early Christian centuries, there were folks who tried to make a harmony of the Gospels, ascribed to Tatian, his laws. So maybe it's that other people came up with other ideas. I think the Turkish scholar Mustafa Ekyol said, well, New Testament scholarship sometimes speaks of a queue, which is behind Matthew and Luke, along with Mark. Maybe it's a queue. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's all hopeful and speculative. There's nothing serious. So, I mean, if we analyze how the Quran speaks of gospel and Torah, it is usually in passages which affirm that what Muhammad experienced and communicated is what Moses and Jesus experienced and communicated. So it's in that apologetic context. I think that's really important to a serious understanding of these terms, in my opinion. So at the beginning of Quran chapter 3, for example, I think it's verses 3 and 4, it simply declares that God has sent down to you um, the book, and he sent down before the Torah and the gospel. And so even the language of God sending down the Torah, sending down the gospel, is the language the Quran uses for God sending down this new scripture to Muhammad. And here I really think it's helpful to disassociate the message about the revelation of this new scripture from the author who has composed these. I think
Hmm.
it's much more, it's hard to come up with a compelling proof here because you can't come up with a more traditional view that's defensible. I recognize that. But to me, it's much more attractive to think of a Quranic author in a sectarian context in which he really needs to advance his claims. There's a new prophet with a new scripture. Christians and Jews are incredulous, they're skeptical, very intense debates. Plus, there's probably violence going on between the communities, all this kind of intense, late antique sectarian controversy. And so, he really wants to make the case that this is something actually authentic, just as Moses and Jesus received authentic revelations. It may sound like I'm getting a bit far afield here, There's lots more that could be said about, the use of these words. Part of the problem is thinking through what these Arabic words would mean. Torah for Torah, Injil for gospel, which comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means gospel. Funny how we got the word gospel in English, but that's another story. I mean, what would those words mean in the context? The word Torah already in Judaism is very complicated because it can
Mm,
refer to the law, it can refer to only the first five books, the books of Moses, it can refer to the whole Bible, it can even just refer to Jewish teaching generally. So that's a complicated word. The word gospel is also a complicated word. So there's lots of kind of dimensions to that debate.
mm.
And do we think there was, even ignoring this question of the texts,
Mhm.
a sense of Islam developing directly from what maybe certain people would say were heretical Jewish or heretical Christian belief systems already in place, and that this wasn't the sudden revelation of a brand new, perhaps, developed by one charismatic or one genius individual religious belief, but rather the
Mhm.
culmination of developing, because we know a lot about these early Christian sects and sort of unusual Jewish sects, which differ greatly from the orthodox
Yes,
canonical accounts
yes,
that we now all know in the
yes.
denominations that have come to dominate. Is there any evidence suggesting that what became Islam was originally a branch off of these established communities
Mhm.
who then, through this vessel,
Mhm.
through this lens, finally created what is now considered to be a sort of third Abrahamic great
Right,
religion?
right, right. Yeah, great question. So, uh, among so-called heretical movements, as concerns the usual suspects, whether they're Christian or Jewish, there's no good evidence that they're connected with the rise of Islam, in my humble opinion. What do I mean by the usual suspects? And this is not just like online, whatever speculation, but even among like, serious academic scholarship, historically, and this starts very early. I mean, this is 19th century scholarship already. They're talking about these groups. So, folks begin thinking, well, the Quran obviously has a low Christology, so it doesn't see Jesus as divine. So maybe one of the early Christian groups, supposedly with a low Christology, some kind of Judaizing group, maybe. So heresiographers, different early Christian heresiographers, mention groups like Ebionites and Alkazites, maybe even the Manichaeans, and so they just throw out names. Or then they go to they try to find something in Arabia. So, you can find in works like Epiphanius's heresiography references to, oh, in Arabia, there was this one group of people who considered Mary a goddess, and that seems to match something in the Quran. On the Jewish side, people often like to say, well, maybe somehow the Essenes, they kind of rejected temple Judaism. They were doing something different out in the desert. Sounds kind of like Islam. So if one investigates kind of the historical context, if those groups existed, when and where they existed, there's no real good case to be made, I think, at all. Anyway, we could circle back to that. However, there were other things happening in the Eastern Church, especially in the sixth and early seventh centuries, principally within the so-called Miaphysite or non-Chalcedonian communities. So this is what today is the Syrian Orthodox churches. So it gets a little complicated when you get into Eastern Christianity, but this was the principal church that was found among Arabic speakers pretty broadly. So up into Syria, but then all the way down into what is today Yemen. It's usually not this so-called Orthodox or Melkite or Chalcedonian Christian church that's connected with Constantinople and Byzantium. It's the Miaphysite church. And in this church, at this time, there were serious debates and accusations. We have lots of records of this. David Bertana of the University of Illinois has written some great things on this. There were debates over how to think about the Trinity, especially, and specifically over the resurrection of the body. Those are two big issues, especially the last one, the resurrection of the body, that are central to the Quran. So I think if we look there at those kinds of debates, there may be something.
I'm curious, despite all of these precedents, despite the monotheism in the area in the 7th century and the links to Syrian Orthodoxy, there seem to be some aspects of early Islam that are unprecedented, and the aspects of the Quran that are unprecedented. The most obvious one being the language. Suddenly, we have this
Yes,
enormous
yes, 100%.
rhymed masterpiece
Yes.
in Arabic, like in this culture that there is pre-Islamic Arabic poetry that's sophisticated and
Maybe,
nuanced.
maybe.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
maybe. Oh, yeah, it's complicated, but stuff has
Yes.
survived that traditionally was interpreted as
Mhm.
pre-Islamic, but it seems to just explode out of nowhere. There seems to be something really unprecedented about the Quran. It seems to come from a source of literary genius that does seem a little strange geographically and historically. I'm curious if you're entertaining the idea of a single author, why you can't just call this single author Muhammad? Why is it specific? Why can't this be Muhammad in your view?
So, if it's okay, I'd like to circle back to the question of the originality of the Quran and
Yes,
the
please.
use of words like masterpiece and genius. So, to me, the use of those words personally is complicated, uh, especially in an academic, like a serious historical critical context. Now, one can say, well, there's nothing like it since we don't have any Arabic book other than the Quran from the time. Therefore, necessarily, it's genius and masterpiece. I mean, if we say the first work in any language, it must reflect some sort of, intellectual creativity and brilliance. Okay, I could concede that. I mean, this is impressive, analogous to, whatever, maybe Beowulf or something, not sure. But that language, genius and masterpiece, it's it's very to me it's very important to think carefully first of all as to how one measures aesthetic brilliance,
It's
but then
famously
also
difficult.
yeah, that's difficult, but then also there is a massive inertia in academic scholarship, despite people say orientalist islamophobia, all this, but there's a huge tradition of just heaping praise on the artistic nature of the Quran. I think in the history of scholarship, it's very interesting. I think part of that reflects the Islamic tradition's insistence that this is an inimitable book, the tradition of recitation. When most folks hear the Quran, they hear it from a professional reciter, following certain rules. So I mean, if you recite a text, it hits differently than if you just read it. So I think that's part of it. And I also think part of it is a long tradition in Western scholarship of scholars in places like Cambridge or Oxford or in Germany, or more recently in the US, who are kind of looking at their colleagues who they suspect of being Eurocentric, closed-minded, all of this. And they're like, bro, you are so like you're so insular. Like, look at the genius of the East. And we find, I think,
Okay, yeah.
analogous language around Buddhist, Hindu, also indigenous texts and traditions. So I actually think I think one should be cautious in that kind of language around the text.
Hmm.
That's kind of a side issue because you were
Yeah,
asking
okay,
about,
yeah.
Muhammad. I don't know if you want to push back on that or I should carry on or
Well,
I mean,
I just like to throw just you as a man, not an academic, but just you as a man who reads Arabic and reads the Quran. What is your personal feeling on its aesthetics? Is it a book that you struggle to translate? Because in the English translations I've read, there is beauty, but not necessarily of the overwhelming constant beam of light that you sometimes hear from sort of traditional Islamic sources who say like this is such an incredibly beautiful book that just to
Mhm,
read the
mhm.
legislature on divorce will convert you immediately. But equally, I know there are some languages that the rhyming doesn't really translate well into English. You can't achieve that
Yes, yes.
consistent of a rhyme scheme. So what do you just feel personally? Do you think it really is a remarkably poetic or evocative or beautiful book, or is it similar to the Bible, a mixed bag of style, quality, certain passages are
Right.
beautiful, certain are certainly not.
It's a great question. Navid Kermani wrote a book called God is Beautiful, first published in German, in which he speaks a lot about the reception of Muslims of specifically the Quran as beautiful, because there are different elements to the Islamic claim of the Quran as a miraculous supernatural text. Part of it is, it has information that couldn't have been known, so it's kind of the data. And another element is the aesthetic of the text. And there's also been a long study in German recently published by Tobias Specker on sort of, he's not a Muslim, he's a Catholic, thinking through just theologically the ways in which Muslims think or describe the Quran's ijaz or inimitability. So there's
Mm.
there's a lot of serious work on this, and I'm not really an expert in the field, but uh, one point is maybe analogous to what you're saying, Milo, about the Bible is Quran is a very mixed text. So, the rhyme is pretty consistent. Obviously, the author, uh, in my mind, because he's interested in creating one book with 114 units for ritual worship, saw the rhyme as a fundamental element to this scripture. But it's a mixed book. I mean, if you look at Surah Al-Baqarah, it's totally different than Surah Al-Rahman, for example. Quran 55, Surah Al-Baqarah, Quran 2, lots of long verses. Quran 55 even has a refrain, which is very different. You have a little bit of that in Quran 54 as well. Those are really the only two surahs where you have that. So it's all very different, which, you know, uh, it's difficult to then for me to give one judgment about the whole book. Some passages I find more artistic, some passages I find less artistic.
Mm. And let's circle around back to that
Okay.
argument for authorship
Yeah.
again. That's something so beautiful, so nuanced, was clearly or must have been from a remarkable individual or set of individuals.
Mhm,
Why not
mhm.
just call this individual Muhammad?
Right. Okay. So the one question is thinking through the relationship between the career of Muhammad and the composition of the book. That's the biggest issue,
Yeah.
actually. But a side issue, which I think I already addressed a little bit, is, whether this is a kind of a remarkable work of genius, which was maybe from a great man. Um, it's okay. Let me touch on that first.
Please.
I know we don't have too much time, but I think that's an interesting element of the history of scholarship as well. Sort of the great man thesis. This comes principally, this will surprise folks, maybe from non-Muslim Western scholarship. Muhammad as great man. So,
I suppose in the Muslim account, he has it's more impressive the lower status he is because it's coming from God.
100%.
Like that's the
Yeah.
whereas for a Westerner who's like, okay, this isn't coming from God. It must just be a genius.
Yes, 100%. Now, eventually, there is a sort of integration of the great man idea, in my opinion, into Islamic apologetics, principally in the 20th century. Uh, so anyway, it's complicated, and I can see maybe weaknesses in my argument that folks rightfully could point out. But in the 19th century, you have even earlier, I mean, really with the beginning of the Enlightenment, you have an interest in the West in Muhammad as a great man. And lots of figures are involved in this. Ernest Renan, also some famous figures like Voltaire and Nietzsche were very interested in Muhammad. Napoleon, the classic great man, was interested in Muhammad as well. Obviously, he went to Egypt. He brought a Quran along with him to Egypt. So anyway, you have this, and then famously, there's a book called On Heroes and Hero Worship by a man named Thomas Carlyle, I think,
Yes.
and there's a whole chapter on Muhammad in there. So you have this idea among kind of secular Enlightenment figures in the West, that Muhammad was one sort of manifestation of this kind of weird, I don't know, chain of great men who show up now and then,
And change
usually
world history by
totally.
speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Napoleon is sort of like number one, the greatest man. But you have these various figures, maybe Charlemagne, certainly in antiquity, Alexander, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, like there's this interest in Muhammad and his genius that was his own sort of gift as a great man. I think some of these guys it gets kind of weird because especially in the Romantic period, so later 19th century with Hegel maybe like they're manifesting some cosmic spirit or something. Okay. Sorry. But I mean that is the element. Now in the 20th century, more and more Muslims, especially those who are attentive to anti-Islamic writing, of which there is a lot, that is important to
Yes.
recognize. They integrate some of this great man language in apologetic scholarship. I'll let that be. But in terms of the single authorship, yeah, I mean the real question is thinking through does this book have literary traits of being a transcript? Either a transcript, this is the standard idea of things Muhammad said here and there that was just compiled, or I guess someone could say, oh, maybe it's not a transcript. The Meccan stuff was not said in Mecca, but it was Muhammad himself who sat down, over a couple of weeks maybe, and wrote down these 114 units, these 114
Mm.
surahs. I guess that's possible. However, uh, to me, it's much more attractive to think of the Quran in the context of the early Islamic community, where there are a couple of things that are key. Two, really. One, the formation of a text for the community's ritual use, which I already mentioned on. And then second, which I haven't spoken about much, is community formation, instilling certain norms in the community. And I guess there's a third as well, which is defending the case that the community
Mm.
is already making for Muhammad. Yeah,
Mm.
Yeah, I think an interesting point we haven't touched on, but which is also often used as evidence of the Quran as a special book, perhaps the Quran as a unique book, is its preservation over the years. The notion that from its first revelation, or at least from its first codex, that not a word, not a line, not a mark of punctuation has been changed, that this is almost supernatural, the degree to which this
hmm
text has been
hmm
maintained in one universal form across the Muslim world, despite the various divisions and schisms
And
that
that's a
exist
very
within the
that's a very
religion.
kind of recent, like
Mm.
modern contemporary argument. Classical Muslim authors usually are not interested in thinking about preservation. Sorry, Milo, I cut you off, but
No,
it's interesting that that's a recent argument.
Mm.
yeah, and my question is how true is this from our
Mm.
documentary evidence, from whatever we have? Is it true that the Quran is remarkably consistent? And if it isn't, what other variations do we have? I'm aware there's the sort of controversy of the satanic verses, so-called interpolated or
Right.
extrapolated. But what do we know about the earliest Qurans to the modern standard text,
Yeah.
and how many deviations really exist?
Yeah. So this another question I think is interesting to sort of approach through the history of ideas, history of scholarship, but also kind of bigger questions of European colonialism, the presence of missionaries in the Islamic world, excuse me, the response of Muslim scholars to modernity. And the reason why this argument shows up and becomes very popular about the perfect preservation of the Quran, in my opinion, is the pressure of principally Christian arguments, but that's usually mixed up just with kind of European domination of the world. And so you have in the 19th century this, new wave of controversial literature between Muslims and Christians, usually Protestants, almost always Protestants from the Christian side. And
Interesting.
that's kind of important. Sorry, we're going to add something,
No,
Jack.
no, no, I just interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A part of that is the colonial context because most of this literature comes from South Asia or Egypt, and less from kind of French zones of the colonial world. But that has an interesting consequence where the question of the preservation of the Quran versus the preservation of the Bible becomes, a key kind of on the menu of debate as a key dish. And yeah, and so you have already, for example, a book called Izhar al-Haq, the manifestation of truth, written by an Indian scholar in I don't know, late 19th century, where he is quoting European biblical scholarship. Already by this point, you have all kinds of insights by, critical academic biblical scholarship, knowledge of manuscripts. And so then he's like, oh, but look, the Quran is in way better shape. And oftentimes, I don't know if this is present from the beginning, but connected to this is a belief or a doubling down on the belief that part of God's providence and favoring of Islam was the preservation of the text, which is interesting, right? Because certain elements, I mean, the Islamic view basically of how God has worked with the world is it kind of stops with Muhammad's death. Muhammad's the last prophet, and God and Muhammad sort of gave to the world the Quran and the Hadith, and then the Muslim community has the task of preserving those. But then with this argument, you get this new element of supernatural intervention after Muhammad's death, which is the preservation of the text. And there's a verse of the Quran which speaks of God as preserver, which is cited to defend. I don't know if that made sense, but that's kind of theologically is interesting. So God is still active in the world in preserving the text. You didn't actually ask about all of that. I mean, you asked like actually the nature of the text. Do you want to follow up, or should I carry on to the nature of the text?
No, I think that's interesting because, of course, it's the premise of the question is that it is a crucially important thing that is essential that no word has shifted. Whereas I think in biblical scholarship, essentially, because that boat has very much sailed, there is a notion of there's
Yes.
a continuity of the text and that there is an essential message and that we can detect the multiple authorship and understand them in their context. And maybe that's a sort of a retreat in a way in the face of overwhelming evidence. But it's that it becomes a curious battleground. But then I suppose having established the battleground, it is interesting to know, well, how true is the claim? And how remarkable is the claim?
Yes.
Because if it's very well preserved, but then many ancient texts are equally well preserved, perhaps it's not so strong a claim to divinity. Whereas if it has this almost unique preservation, because there is something about the Quran's being memorized by such a large number of people, presumably the longest book to be memorized by so many people in human history. So it exists not merely sort of
Yeah.
on the page, but
Right.
mentally.
Right. So the data of the manuscripts is pretty clear that the skeletal consonantal form of the text is very consistent. The early manuscripts, with one exception, all have this same basic form of the text. Um, and then the data is also very clear that Muslims disagreed about how to read this text. So, and this is where you get the genesis in Islamic tradition of different reading traditions, which are eventually kind of organized first into seven. So in the 10th century, you have kind of um, an agreement that there are basically seven ways to read the text. Actually, each of those seven has two variations. It's kind of 14. And then later with Ibn al-Jazari, that goes to 10, even to 14 ways to read the text. So that's interesting, not just because you have different ways of reading the text, but because it shows us that, in my opinion, folks will push back against this, but in my opinion, the data shows that what was key was the written transmission of the skeletal consonantal text, what in Arabic people call the rasam, the basic text, that was transmitted in a written form. And then because it doesn't actually tell you how to read the text, how to pronounce the text, doesn't distinguish between every word, this text, when it was transmitted, was read in different ways. And that's important because it suggests there was not a sort of an unbroken, continuous, agreed upon oral transmission of the text. It was a written text that was standard, and then you had this disagreement about how to read it.
Okay, but can we get the statement on, I suppose, comparative to other ancient texts? We consider it a well-preserved document.
So I don't know because I don't know really what standard by which to measure it. There's
Hmm.
so many variations, if we speak about other texts, whether it's from South Asia or China, or Greeks or something, I don't know. Um, and also I think it's better to maybe assess this kind of question in different ways that make the stakes a little bit lower. Like, let's just look at the transmission of the text.
Hmm.
I think to make comparative comments or yeah, puts it in the kind of the yes or no, is the Quran, therefore, is this argument right or wrong? And I
Sure.
think the real story is more interesting, which you look at the historical context that gave us this manuscript
Do you
evidence.
feel like the high stakes of Islamic scholarships, the high stakes of textual criticism, has in some ways like held back Islamic studies?
Yeah, I think even theologically, it may not be Jack exactly what you're asking, but I think for Muslims to double down on, for example, like the letter for letter, vowel for vowel transmission of the text, it complicates things for serious theological work for Muslims. I mean, I teach in the Department of Theology. I'm a Catholic. I'm interested in theological questions. And, like even classical Muslim scholars, they're very comfortable speaking about not only different ways of reading the text, but they would cite versions of the Quran that were attributed to other companions that never made it into the standard text. And they would cite them
Mm.
for trying to understand God's revelation. I could give examples of that. So there was a kind of freedom of using the data of Scripture for theological work that existed in the classical period that can be really limited by what folks may see as the need for an apologetical argument in this regard. I don't know if that makes sense. So, I mean, it's not for me to give lessons, but sometimes this happens with Christianity as well. Like think of creationists, that insist on Genesis 1, being the real history, historically, scientifically, of the formation of the universe.
Sure, but it
And
feels
that's
like a
going to
weaker
mess up
lobby.
your, sorry?
It feels like a weaker lobby, the
Yes,
creationists on biblical studies guys. Like
yes.
I don't feel like a creationist can like really like give Bart Ehrman any job jeopardy. In I don't know. I don't know. Do you feel like this pushback, like in the comments to all your videos, there is inevitably loads and loads of Islamic apologists,
Right.
sometimes accusing you of like satanic influence. All of these things just seem to come with Islamic scholarship in a way that I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you feel in your New Testament guys they're getting just as much of that.
I know it's way more intense in Quranic studies. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. I mean, yeah, so down the hall, I've got two terrific New Testament scholars here, and yeah, we chat over coffee, and it's way more intense. Having said that, there's also, there's a terrific generation of academic, believing Muslim scholars, also scholars from a Muslim heritage that just work in a historic critical way with maybe no belief or interest in theology. But I mean, yeah, they're terrific conversation partners. Uh, you know, I work a lot back and forth with, for example, Saqib Hussein, who's at Loyola Marymount, he's a Muslim scholar working in a Jesuit place, Mohsen Goodarzi at Harvard. So there really is a lot of positive stuff going on as
Yeah.
well.
Okay, you need to go, I
I
think,
do. I'm
Gabriel. Yeah,
sorry.
it's
Yeah,
been a joy. Thank you so much for making time. Delighted to have you on.
terrific. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye
you very
bye. Have a
much.
lovely day.